This world would exist if the Nazis had won World War II. The argument is empathy makes you do things that are against your own personal best interests, and as an extension, the best interests of civilization. The truth is, this toxic empathy is a dangerous guide for our decisions, behavior, and public policy. This is basically making up new definitions. Take what already exists, add your own stuff to it, create a straw man, and then say, well, this is really bad. To empathize with a gay person or a transgender person is to affirm that everything that they've done, all of their life choices, everything they stand for, I stand for that too. That's just not true. That's an incoherent argument. The person that you despise the most is a reflector of God's image. Evil, I think, is the absence of empathy.
Jesse, you wrote an article in the June issue of Science titled, "Is Empathy Killing the West?" And your opening line was really interesting, I thought. It reads, "I don't know if you've heard, but apparently the culprit for the supposed decline of the Western world is an innocuous attribute called empathy." Now, when I read this, I thought, whoa, hang on. I haven't heard anything about this. From what I understand, people have been talking about empathy for like the last decade as a good thing, and we need to have more of it. So, for anyone whose algorithm is perhaps like mine and hasn't heard of how empathy is all of a sudden this terrible thing, can you summarize what this article in a few sentences or a few words is all about?
Sure. I think probably for most people reading this, there's a few things that will tip them off to what this is all about. I suppose, in a few words, this is about culture war issues. There is a culture war raging around a number of key issues, issues that they find their nexus in this idea of empathy, at least in the estimation of a couple of the key figures that we will discuss in this podcast. Essentially, the argument is empathy is bad because it makes you do things that are against your own personal best interests, and as an extension, the best interests of civilization, capital C. But that is a conclusion that I challenge and hopefully make a good case against in this article. And I guess we'll see if I make a good enough case for it.
Interesting. I might play devil's advocate a little bit here and there, but it might be good just to start. I feel like there's often confusion around what empathy is and isn't, and people confuse it with sympathy as well. Can we just start by defining what is empathy? Where does that word come from?
Yeah, empathy as a word has only really been around for the last 100 years. It comes originally from ancient Greek. En as in, and pathos as in feeling. So empatheia is the Greek word that empathy comes from. Not a commonly used word. We don't see it in the Bible. We don't see it in a lot of ancient writings. And it's just one of these words that got lost to time in a way. But there was a German philosopher by the name of Rudolf Lotz, who in the mid 19th century resurrected this idea. And being a German, he translated the Greek into German. And the word is Einfühlung, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing that, but it's a literal translation of taking the Greek words and making them German. Empathy was not about what we think about it today. It was about animating objects with feeling, with emotion, to see activity or life in things that otherwise would be considered inanimate. So quite a German philosophical kind of tradition. You can imagine these sorts of idiosyncratic definitions coming out of that tradition. But fast forward a little bit, and Edward Titchener, the British psychologist, early 20th century, translates the word from German to English, and that's how we get empathy. This is what he says: "Not only do I see gravity and modesty and pride and courtesy and stateliness, but I feel or act them in the mind's muscles." This is, I suppose, a simple case of empathy, if we may coin that term as a rendering of Einfühlung, There is nothing curious or idiosyncratic about it, but it is a fact that must be mentioned. And this is the first time that we see empathy being used in English. And again, the word, had a little bit of meaning, but it wasn't until the 1950s that the word began to resemble what we think of today as empathy. This is primarily due to the explosion in the psychological movement that happened around figures like Jean Piaget, Carl Rogers, who developed.
You pronounced that great, by the way.
Thank you. So, empathy became a really key feature in the development of these psychological frameworks. And of course, as many things become trendy, when we get into the 80s, the 90s, the early noughties, we see empathy make the leap again from the world of clinical psychology to leadership, to business, the business world. I think a lot of people probably think of Brene Brown and people like her when they think of empathy. I think Brene Brown, particularly, has almost single handedly built her career on the word empathy.
Mm.
And there are others like her who have similarly used this word quite extensively in their work.
So I guess just to clarify, one of those old English names describes it as like feeling
In
into,
feeling,
and
yeah.
that's yeah, which is empathy, as opposed to like sympathy, which is more acknowledging someone's feelings.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
the comparison I've often heard most is the difference between sympathy and compassion. People often
Mm.
erroneously put the words co and passion together to describe what compassion is, to suffer alongside somebody, whereas sympathy is more of a detached feeling, like seeing
Mm.
somebody, let's say a homeless person on the side of the road, feeling a little bit sad for them, but then continuing on their way, not really involving themselves so much in the situation.
Yeah.
Whereas to take compassion upon that same person might involve giving them money, helping them out in some way, shape, or form, actually doing something as a result of seeing the need. I think empathy is perhaps even more involved than compassion because it's not just about coming alongside somebody, it's about putting oneself in their shoes to imagine what life is like from their perspective and to appreciate what it is that person needs, not on your terms, but on theirs. So,
Yeah.
Carl Rogers, the founder of CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, he said that empathy meant entering the private world of somebody else, to make yourself at
Mm.
home within it, and to see the world literally through their perspective. That's how I would think about it. That doesn't necessarily mean that's the definitive definition, but that's how I would think about it.
No, I think that's helpful. Now, getting onto this culture war issue, correct me if I'm wrong, but these ideas have largely kind of come from a few different books that you've referenced in your article. And I thought it'd be helpful just to list some of those titles because they explain the thoughts that are behind them. So the books that you referenced were Toxic Empathy: How Progressives Exploit Christian Compassion. The second one is Against Empathy: The Case for Rational Compassion. And the third one is The Sin of Empathy, Compassion and Its Counterfeits. Do these books all have the same kind of like argument to them, or what are they getting at with their books?
Yeah, so they're all a little bit different. The one that's most different is probably Against Empathy, The Case for Rational Compassion by Paul Bloom. This is from a secular writer. The other two are very much evangelical Christians. Paul Bloom argues against empathy on the basis of advocating for a more sympathetic slash compassionate viewpoint, how that's actually a better thing than empathizing. Again, going back to our loosey goosey definitions, he argues that
Mhm.
sympathy or even compassion is more rational because it does not involve you putting yourself in the shoes of another person. Therefore, his argument is that it allows you to be more, when it comes to assessing things like need, culture war issues, etc., etc. So his is a little bit more clinical. However, Ali Beth Stuckey and Joe Rigney, the authors of the other two books, are very much inserting themselves into the culture war. And the thing that I find probably a little bit difficult when talking about these two is they're very much of the moment. And so it's impossible to know whether in 5, 10 years their contentions will still be relevant or whether they'll be like totally outdated. But if you were to sit for a second with some of the cultural issues that they talk about, yeah, they're big right now. They're contentious issues right now.
By that, do you mean that they're talking about current world events as opposed to past events, future?
Yeah. So Ali Beth Stuckey very much talks about current hot button issues. So she talks about abortion, immigration, the LGBT community, things like that. Joe Rigney is a pastor. Ali Beth Stuckey is not. So Joe Rigney talks more, he writes a lot for like leadership and like pastoral church leaders, that sort of niche. So his is definitely more like laser focus on churches, church leadership, and issues that churches talk about. He talks a lot about some of the stuff that Ali Beth Stuckey talks about, but he does focus also on things that you might expect from like a reformed evangelical women in ministry and things like that.
It's such an interesting idea to me, this whole toxic empathy thing, because it's so against the grain of what you like. I've read a lot of Brene Brown and a lot of like therapists and their views on empathy and it being something that we should strive to have more of and strive to feel more towards other people. And so I think reading your article and I guess looking over these books, it's like, whoa, wait, I don't understand. Where has this come from? But we've obviously looked at empathy, but I think it'd be good now to circle around to what do you actually mean when you say toxic empathy? What is that? What are we talking about when we say that?
I'll let me read a little section from Ali Beth Stuckey. I think she puts it like she makes her case pretty well in one of these opening paragraphs. She says, it's toxic empathy that pushes us not only to have compassion for someone's difficulties, but to unquestioningly affirm their feelings because if we were in their shoes, we'd want our feelings to be affirmed. But what about when affirmation causes damage to the very people we say we're loving? The truth is, this toxic empathy is a dangerous guide for our decisions, behavior, and public policy. So, to put a little bit of meat on those bones, think of the culture war issues that are raging right now and have been for a couple of years. Let's take immigration, for example, right? At the time of recording, the LA riots are still happening and
Mm.
we don't know how long they're going to be raging for. A view of toxic empathy would say somebody who has entered a country illegally, right? Because they wanted a better life, they were fleeing, they were wanting to seek asylum, or for any of the number of reasons why people emigrate. To put oneself in their shoes, to empathize with them, is to affirm that everything they stand for and everything they do is right and correct. The idea is that by doing so, it allows you or it forces you to not only not be able to critique or ask questions about the reasons why they did what they did, but to also just tacitly support everything they do. So the classic conservative evangelical might look at an immigrant who entered their country illegally and assume that they perhaps are a criminal or that they're a danger to innocence, any of the number of things that people might say about somebody. But to empathize with that person in their minds, and this is them, how I said that definitions are loosey goosey. This is basically making up new definitions on top of definitions that already exist. So that's what you have to do to be
Mm.
able to arrive at these conclusions. You have to take what already exists and then add your own stuff to it and essentially create a straw man and then say, this is really bad and this is why. And when you do that, it's really easy to see why a lot of people would go, oh, yeah, that's really bad. To empathize with, let's say, a gay person or a transgender person is to then affirm that everything that they've done, all of their life choices, everything they stand for, I stand for that too,
Mm.
right? So that somebody who's had an abortion, let's say a woman in church leadership, all of these issues that people get really upset about and have these massive arguments about, in their mind, toxic empathy is basically conflating I can put myself in your shoes with I tacitly agree with everything that you are, everything that you've decided, and everything you stand for, which
Hmm.
I think if you listen closely to our definition of empathy beforehand, you'll notice that all that stuff is not in there. It's actually, you have to tack on a whole bunch of stuff in order to make empathy this really bad thing.
So is toxic empathy also, because if I was to think of the word toxic empathy without reading your article just to think about what that means, I would probably think that looks like enabling things. Like some people can be so extremely, I was about to say optimistic. Some people can be so extremely
Mm.
empathetic that they just pardon things. Like, for example, if you look at highly, highly, highly empathetic people, they're more likely to be in relationships with like abusers or with narcissists because they get to that attitude of, oh, but I understand why they're doing this. And then they just pardon it. Are we talking about the same thing when we talk about empathy? Because to me, toxic empathy, when I think like in that way, is I understand it, but I'm not sure I'm thinking the same as like these writers and these thinkers that you're talking about.
No, I don't think you are, because most intelligent thinking people would realize that there is a certain line that you just don't cross when it comes to empathy. I think Ali Beth Stuckey uses the example of a drug addict. To empathize with a drug addict is to not say, hey, I've got a bong, let's get another hit of heroin in, because obviously that's really bad for them. Or handing an alcoholic a beer or whatever. Like that's just the extreme to which they would go to say, if you're going to take empathy to its most logical conclusion, that's where you're going to end up.
Yeah.
But I think it makes people out to be more dumb and less intelligent than people generally are. Like, I think most people, as I said, who are thinking and intelligent would go, yeah, it's not a good idea to hand a drug addict a joint. But I think it's also true that it's possible to put oneself in the shoes of another whilst not agreeing with literally everything that they stand for. I just don't think
Hmm.
it's possible to give tacit sort of approval to any person for everything that they stand for, no matter how
Hmm.
aligned you might be with somebody else politically, religiously, socially. There are going to be things that you disagree with. It's impractical. It doesn't work in the real world. And so this idea
Hmm.
that empathy is this slippery slope is, I think, convenient. On one hand, it's very convenient to be able to do that, but it's also convenient that it only works one way. So it doesn't work when it comes to issues, for instance, that these authors might support that other people might take issue with. It's part of the straw man that we're talking about here.
Yeah, interesting. Elon Musk, you mentioned him in your article. He talked about this idea on the Joe Rogan podcast. And Elon said, I believe in empathy. Empathy is good, but, and he went on to say, but you need to think it through.
Yes.
What are these buts he's getting at?
So this is where the "Is Empathy Killing the West" clickbait title comes into
Yeah.
it. Look, Elon Musk is a computer guy. He's a programmer guy. He talks a lot about programming and code and all this sort of stuff. And so that's the way that he conceptualizes the idea. He conceptualizes it as kind of like a bug in the system. It's like these ads on the internet. One simple trick. Doctors hate this one simple trick. And this is the one simple trick that people hate. It's going to
Yeah.
bring down Western civilization. And it's not his idea. He's quoting a guy by the name of Gad Sard, who is a frequent guest on the Joe Rogan Experience. And he talks about how it's basically you enable empathy so much to the point where basically you've got civilizational suicide. And this is incredibly high level, kind of extreme thinking here. But
I was like, wait, what's
civilizational
civilization?
suicide
Yeah.
It's basically you enable so much, you empathize so much that you allow a lot of it. I think comes down to this idea of uh, left wing politics is really soft on things like crime. That's something that people say. That was definitely part of the Donald Trump election campaign. The fact that the border wasn't protected or whatever, that he'd be tough on crime. So that's I think part of what's going on here. The idea that if you're empathetic, you're probably more left leaning. If you're more left leaning, you're empathetic, then you're going to be less tough on crime. If you're less tough on crime, you can allow more stuff to happen, and civilization is going to break down. Society is going to break down because you're just like, oh, we got to let people live their lives and just be really open minded and all that. That's sort of like the disaster scenario. A lot of this conversation as well is around things like Islamophobia. The UK is often pointed to as Muslims are taking over. So there's all like very, very extreme, I guess, panic conversation. So I'm doing a pretty bad job of explaining it just because it is so broad and because in some ways the argument is incoherent because it's just so difficult to pin down exactly how they see this happening. They
Mm,
take a culture war issue, they'll take it to its most extreme level, but they don't actually think through what the nuts and bolts of it is because it doesn't matter ultimately how any of this is going to come about. It's just that it is going to come about. If you push them on, like, how does it actually happen? It's all conjecture. None of it is based on
mm,
data, research, or anything scientific. It's all based ultimately on ideology. And the reality is, books get published like this because there is an audience for it who
mm,
have already come to the same conclusion. They just don't have the words to describe it in the way that these authors or these, speakers are able to. And yet, so when these books get published, they get lapped up because it's like, okay, this is what I already think. It's just that it's presented in
mm.
a way that makes me feel smart about my views being a little bit edgy or whatever.
Even the title, like the sin of empathy, is interesting. Like, even if I don't really believe that I saw that, I would be like, huh, what is this all about? And I'd be intrigued, just as I'm sure, obviously, you have been intrigued by this idea and have taken an interest in these books. It's not necessarily your belief, but it's like a catchy title, or it's like a bold thing to claim that it draws people in. But yeah, it reminds me of, in your article, you referred to a psychologist who believed and taught that empathy was like a vital component to children's development. And without empathy, a child wouldn't be able to grow and become like a functioning, healthy part of society. And now that was in the 1950s, and now 75 years later, you're seeing books with the
Mm,
opposite
mm.
headline.
I think it speaks to the fact that you mentioned before that you just assumed that empathy was a good thing and that's a foregone conclusion. I think that's the society that we live in. That's the air we breathe, that empathy is a good thing, that we should have it, that we should practice it, and that we should strive for it when it is lacking. So the fact that
Mm,
we live in a society where empathy is by and large accepted as being the norm, I think speaks to just how bizarre it is that now. Yeah, so like toxic empathy, I think came out last year, 2024, and the sin of empathy came out this year. When I first started writing the article, it hadn't even been released yet. It's quite the progression. We've gone from empathy being toxic to it being a sin. And I can't help but wonder how much it was influenced by the early weeks of the Trump administration, his second term, where the idea of empathy became much more of a heated discussion. And we could
mm,
talk about that a bit more, but ultimately it's just one of those things where it was the flavor of the month for 3 seconds, and then the next thing came along. It's overwhelming how quickly that
mm.
sort of news cycle works.
Yeah, yeah. I'm not sure if you've heard about this. This is something that I guess I've just read recently, is this idea that empathy has declined by 40% since 1979. And young children today are the least empathetic they've ever been in history,
Wow.
apparently. And I'm sure this isn't because of the books,
They've
because
all just
they're
read
kids.
the books. Oh no.
But it's an interesting
Yeah.
correlation. But basically, they've done all these studies to look at why this is. And obviously, the obvious candidate is like kids are on screens more than ever before. But interestingly, they're actually reading less fiction than ever before. And I think the thing about like fiction, even though it's fiction, it's like you're still stepping inside someone else's shoes and you're still learning another person's perspective and like walking through someone else's life that is completely different to yours usually. And I think you're going on that whole like emotional journey with whatever character it is. And so you learn to do that in real life as well. Like you learn to just question things and empathize with people naturally because you're used to doing
Hmm.
that stories. And so I think that's just a yeah coincidence with what we're talking about
That's
today.
so interesting. I hadn't considered that factor. And it's interesting when you think about the books that especially young men are reading these days, they tend to be more and more like bro finances and self help and all that sort of stuff. I did read an article a few months ago about how men are reading less fiction in general than they used to, which is, yeah, very interesting. Very
Mm.
interesting.
Now, reading your article, we touched on this a little bit before, but I'm kind of interested in it. You're obviously looking at those who are saying empathy is killing the West and that it's like a negative thing. And your defense is on the other side, empathy is like a non negotiable. It's what we see in the Bible, it's like a good thing. Is there not a middle ground? Like, I know that you're talking about like people have this intelligence, but I kind of question, do people have intelligence? Are people like, what is that like healthy kind of zone of
Yeah.
empathy?
Again, I think we have to address the straw man that these proponents are setting up. The idea that empathizing with somebody means that you tacitly agree with everything that they believe and that they stand for and everything they've done. That's just not true. That's an incoherent argument. Empathy, I believe, is a fundamental tool to the thing that really helps us as humans, that has helped us as humans and will continue to help us thrive. And going back to the idea of civilization, really makes civilization possible. And that's cooperation. People talk a lot about what sets us apart from the animals. And a lot of people talk about consciousness. A lot of people talk about language and shared culture and things like that. None of that's really possible without empathy because animals don't really do this. Cats don't really put themselves in the paws of other cats, and dogs don't really put themselves in the paws of other dogs. Animals are mostly driven by instinct, by the need to survive. And yes, mummy and daddy, dogs and cats care for their young, but it's driven again by instinct and instinct to survive, to reproduce, to populate, to make sure that their genetic code endures. On the other hand, humans are driven by much more complex motivations, and empathy is key to cooperation. Without cooperation, there can be no society and no civilization. Cooperation is what forced nomadic tribes to band together to form townships and villages, to then form city states, to then form civilizations. Um, Without cooperation, you can't have city walls, you can't have spears and swords, you can't have agriculture. So, empathy is key to that because when you put yourself in the shoes of another, you not only see what life is like from their perspective, you see what life can be like if we work together. So, that is, I think, key to civilization and key to human flourishing. To take it a step further, I believe that as a Christian, empathy is also non negotiable. And I love to use this device sometimes because I know that some of our audience is Christian, some of our audience is agnostic, atheist, other, whatever. If you are not a Christian, I believe this is the bar by which you measure whether somebody really is a follower of Jesus or is just a cultural Christian. Because Jesus very clearly teaches empathy in his life, and he calls his disciples to do the same. The emblematic example of this is the parable of the sheep and the goats. It's sort of like an apocalyptic scene, and Jesus talks about the king being him, separating his followers into the sheep and the goats. This is found in Matthew 25, where He says to the goats, being goat is bad, which you'll see in a moment, I was hungry, you gave me nothing to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me nothing to drink. I was a stranger, and you did not invite me in. I needed clothes, you did not clothe me. I was sick and in prison, and you didn't look after me. Then he says to the sheep, all of those things that the goats didn't do, you did. And both groups are equally confused. And they're like, well, Jesus, did we do any of that stuff or not do any of that stuff? To which he slams at the very end, whatever you did or did not do for any of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. So, in
Mm.
other words, uh, what you do or do not do for people who are the least of these, and scholars argue about what the least of these means. And I think Jesus is pretty clear. Least of these is people that you don't really like, who aren't like you, who maybe don't have as much as you.
Mm.
Whoever is your neighbor, as Jesus talks about in the parable of the Good Samaritan, Samaritans being the enemies of the Jews, that's what you've done to me. So, like, to me, it's clear. Uh,
Mm.
Jesus
Yeah.
exhibits compassion, he exhibits a level of sympathy, but more than anything else, empathy has to be part of that equation.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but empathy is never actually used in the
No.
Bible, but it is what Jesus embodied. Like the whole, he came to earth to experience what it's like to be human, to experience what pain and loss was inside human
Yeah.
form, to actually know what we feel from like the inside out. Like the creator of the universe did that to try and understand the human condition. He's not just looking from the outside judging, he fully stepped into it. And I think that's a good example of what we're talking about, stepping in someone inside someone's shoes,
Yeah.
literally.
Yeah. And I mean, look, this is part of John's gospel. And in John chapter 1, talks about how if empathy is, as Carl Rogers puts it, making oneself at home in the life of somebody else, John illustrates this perfectly by saying God became a man, became human, and dwelt among us. It literally pitched his tent. He tabernacled among us, so he becomes one of us. And Paul talks about this in, I believe, First Thessalonians, where he talks about Jesus not seeing equality with God as something to be grasped, made himself like a slave and stepped into the shoes of humanity. And again, this is clear. It's not explicit. Empatheia in the Greek is not a feature of the New Testament, but it is exhibited in the life of Jesus and in his teachings.
I think sometimes publishers want to sell books, and so they put these controversial titles on their covers. And maybe these writers, I haven't actually read the books to be honest, but maybe they are thinking from the extreme side of empathy is bad, let's get rid of it completely. But I don't think you're also advocating that empathy is good, full stop. Like you're also advocating for intelligence and wisdom
Yeah.
throughout life. So,
Again, I think, it's all in how you define what empathy is. And you
mm,
can engage if you want in the straw man of what they say empathy is, but I think that's misrepresenting what empathy really truly is. And I think
mm.
it's not very helpful in helping us as society work through some of the complex issues that we find ourselves in. It's just building more walls rather than bridges.
Going back to what Elon Musk said, saying empathy is good, but dot. Were there any things as you were reading these thinkers and authors, I guess, books and thoughts? Was there any point that you were like, empathy is good, but I do see where they're coming from?
Yeah, look, the thing that I would find to have issue with, and this is not coming from a well researched, scientific, data driven perspective. This is me and my preferences. So take that for what it is. Uh, there is
Sure.
often a level of virtue signaling with empathy that seems good, that seems right and correct, but often doesn't actually mean anything or is just for show. So perhaps this is where a lot of people would point to woke culture as being something that is problematic or not helpful.
Mm.
And I do find it interesting that there are as many different people from different walks of life who are against woke culture as there are proponents for it. I was quite surprised that Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist, absolutely abhors woke culture. But at the same time, abhors conservative Christianity. It seemed like he would be a natural ally to wokies, as he calls them, but he's not, primarily because he perceives them as being aligned with Islam, which he fears. And he has been an outspoken critic of, and he's gotten in trouble quite a lot for talking about that sort of stuff. I wouldn't necessarily go as far as Richard Dawkins. That's probably not saying much, but I do think that there is a level of empathy that it just isn't helpful. Standing by somebody just because it's fashionable or because it's socially apropos to do so, it isn't always necessarily helpful. And sometimes it is political. I think most people assume if you're left leaning, you're going to be standing alongside immigrants and women and the LGBT community, and the list goes on, all that sort of stuff. But I think there's also an assumption that if you're perhaps a little bit more center right, that you must stand against them. And I think that's a dichotomy that is uh, absolutely unhelpful, at least as far as solving some of these issues. I think empathy is actually a really powerful tool in solving these issues. But I think if we create this empathy straw man, as I've been talking about it, and as they've constructed it, there's no hope that we'll ever solve these issues. They'll just get worse and worse.
Yeah, a world without empathy just strikes me as a very judgmental, feelingless world. You've probably dived into this a lot deeper and maybe have dwelt about the potentiality of where that mindset could go. But how do we conjure up more empathy? Like, how do we have a healthier state of empathy?
Oh, man. Can I talk a little bit about a world without empathy first? Because I,
Yeah,
I
I'd love you to.
do. We actually have a great example of this. And I know that a lot of people are probably going to be a bit aghast at this, but I'm just going to say it anyway. This world would exist if the Nazis had won World War II. So Joseph Goebbels was Hitler's chief propagandist during Nazi Germany. He was an incredibly intelligent, cunning, media literate. He leveraged the power of radio when radio was just in its infancy, and he used radio primarily, but also film and television um, to propagandize and to basically brainwash Germany and everywhere that Germany extended to in the 1930s all the way up to the early 1940s. Goebbels was completely cognizant of the BS of anti-Semitism and the Nazi message. He was so there's a diary that he kept. If you want to buy it, I haven't bought it, but if you want to buy Joseph Goebbels' diary, you can. And in this diary, he talks a lot about the power of dehumanizing the Jew, of making the average German see the Jew, the gypsy, the black person, the disabled person, the gay person as not human. When you eliminate empathy from public discourse, at least when it comes to specific types of people, you end up with Nazi Germany, with Auschwitz and Treblinka and these death camps. The only way that they are possible is if you see your fellow man, fellow woman, fellow child as less than human. Goebbels committed suicide in the bunker alongside Hitler and a lot of his cronies when the Soviets took Berlin. But a number of high ranking Nazis like Joachim von Ribbentrop, who basically helped broker the deal between the Soviet Union and Germany in the beginning of the war, Hermann Goering, Wilhelm Keitel, a lot of these very famous Nazis were caught and they were tried at Nuremberg. Everybody knows about the Nuremberg trials. Nuremberg was like the place for the Nazis. That's why it was chosen. A couple of them committed suicide in their cells, but some of them were tried and hung for their crimes. There was a psychologist who basically became a confidant, a kind of prison doctor, whatever. His name was Gustav Gilbert. He wrote another famous book called Nuremberg Diary, and he's in dialogue with somebody else, and in one particular passage, as he's talking about the conversations he's had with these high-ranking Nazis, with conversations he's listened in onto, he says this: I was searching for the nature of evil, and I think I've come close to it, and it's a lack of empathy. It's the one
Hmm.
characteristic that connects all the defendants. It's a genuine incapacity to feel with their fellow man. This is, I think, for me, the bombshell of the entire article, the entire idea. Evil, says Gilbert, I think, is the lack, the absence of empathy. And so when I think of this idea, this is like, we just can't go there again.
Hmm.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
If we allow ourselves to degrade, to erode the idea of empathy, to treat it as something that is objectionable, and at worst is something we should throw away, I can see no other conclusion, no other destination than something that looks like 1930s, 1940s Germany. And
Hmm.
whether you're horrified by that or don't care, I just think that is something that we, as a society, a world, cannot afford to go back to.
It's crazy that he's saying I was searching for the nature of evil, and for him, it was a lack of empathy. In contrast to these titles, the sin of empathy. It's like
This is what's so scary.
fully. What do we do with that as we have a culture of people who are following that line of thinking? And I'm sure there are a lot of people who are like disagreeing with that and in line with what you're saying about where that could lead up and where that could take
Yep.
us. How do we live in that world, and how do we become, obviously we can do more to become more empathetic, I'm sure, but what do we do
Yeah.
with that?
The thing that scares me and that saddens me at the same time is the fact that a lot of this is coming from the Christian world. And
Hmm.
as a Christian, I don't have to look very far to see all of the counters to the arguments that they're making. But if somebody's listening to this and they're questioning whether I'm full of it, just if this is just rubbish and I'm being alarmist or whatever, I just invite you to sit with the Psalms. Psalm 139, verse 14 says that each of us is fearfully and wonderfully made. And if you're like a middle class white Christian living in the middle of Kentucky or whatever, that's you. If you're a somebody in Thailand or whatever in the middle of the red light district, that's you. If you're a Muslim in Birmingham in the UK, that's you. Doesn't matter who you are. Every single person is made in the image of God, is a reflection of God. Doesn't matter if we all look different, we sound different, we have different ideologies. The power of Christianity is that it's not really a religion in the sense of what ancient people thought of as religion. Ancient people thought of religion as being like, hey, we've got our God here in our little place, in our little space, and you've got your God over there, and he has jurisdiction in your space, and our God has jurisdiction in our space, and neither shall the two meet. Jesus comes and blows this away and says, all peoples, all nations find their fullness and find their purpose in the Savior. And for every person to be made in the image of God means that every person is worthy of love, of respect, and of empathy. I think dwelling on the idea that the person that you despise the most, the person that frustrates you the most, the person that you disagree with the most, religiously, politically, whatever, that person is made in God's image. That person is a reflector of God's image. I think we just need to let that sit a little bit. Because if we can see the people we disagree with the most, perhaps the people we hate, as being worthy of respect, of love, of kindness and empathy, I think part of the reason why we bow away from empathy is because that's really hard. It's possibly too hard. But if you're a Christian, you don't have a choice. I don't have a choice. This is, as I've said, a non negotiable. And so I think that we need to be dwelling on that more personally. I think we need to be talking about that more. And again, I think we need to reflect on the way that Jesus exhibits this in his life, in his ministry, because I don't think the alternative is worth giving it all away for.